Hi, my name is Corinne Maury, and I'm a terminated nurse from Nelson, BC. I have some bad news to share. The BC Nurses Union has died. The union struggled with a terminal illness for the last several years, and unbeknownst to its members, it actually succumbed to this disease. The NDP government graciously moved in and provided MAID, which is medically assisted death, to ensure that there would be one less functional entity in place to protect BC workers. The BC Nurses Union was not the only union that was exposed to this contagion, and the NDP government and its unlicensed medical practice has actually resulted in the demise of many of the protective mechanisms that are in place in this province for BC workers. Over the last few months, the NDP government has been pushing through bills, Bill 4 for the trade sector, Bill 36 for the healthcare professions, that are systematically removing all protections for workers and is now giving themselves unprecedented control and authority to implement policy that is starting to show in the catastrophic collapse of all the services that we have. This is a story of the nurses and their investigation of our union, the things that we have found in terms of cooperation with the government against its own members, and the layers of all the interconnected pieces that we are seeing has created such catastrophic damage to our society. If this is a story that interests you, stay tuned. Hi. So in order now for us to understand a bit of the mess that we're in, I'm going to give a little bit of background on the legal mechanisms that are in place in this province. Currently, we have 1 in 3 workers are unionized. Now, historically, unions were formed because they ensured that there was fair wages, safe environment, safe practice, the ability to fairly get a job. And as time has progressed, the function of unions has changed because there has been the creation of employment law that actually protect workers more generally. And the function of the union has been basically to enforce that the employer is following the rules of the game. Now, this is how I'd like to explain it, is that when you have an employer, and in my case, it would be a health authority, and I have my union who is representing my interests, every 3 years, they come up with an agreement, which are basically the rules of the game that everyone is supposed to play by. The function of the union is that it enforces that the employer plays by the rules. And so the primary mechanism that they use for that is a grievance process. So if there is an issue between you and your employer, the union files a grievance. It goes through a few steps where the employer is given the opportunity to resolve this issue. And then if there is no resolution, then the union has the ability to involve an arbitrator to make an independent decision on behalf of the employee. So these are the steps that right now the union's main function is. Currently, Canada is one of the worst countries in terms of the law that requires unions to disclose what is going on in their operations and the financial management that is occurring within a union. Other countries such as Australia, Europe, the States, all make union membership voluntary, whereas in Canada it is mandatory. You are forced to become a union member. And yet at the same time, our disclosure laws are considerably a lower bar than other countries. Unions right now are considered non-profit organizations which means they do not have to file income tax or pay income tax. The amount of disclosure that they have to provide to the government is less than you as a private individual. And I'll give you an example. I have obtained the financial statements from the BC Nurses Union from the years 2017 to 2021. And the front page of every one of these statements says that these are a qualified opinion. And what this means is that the proof of revenues was not verified, and as a result, any of the other calculations that they have adjusted cannot be determined to be accurate. So basically, the union provided them numbers. They created financial statements from the numbers that the union provided, but they are stating very clearly that they have not verified any of them. And so the information that is provided to you as a union member, and in this case, this union is running $565 million worth of assets, there is actually no information provided to you as to what's going on with your money. Now, in order for unions to maintain this tax-free status, they actually have conditions that they have to meet. And two of the ones that I'll highlight is one, they can't show a profit, and two, they have to protect the socioeconomic well-being of its members. Now, I'm going to be speaking more about the BC Nurses Union because that's the information that I've collected, but I do want you to know that I am in contact with many other union members from other unions, and they have experienced the same kind of issues that we have. So nurses, there are, I think, 48,000 members in the BC Nurses Union. And then there is another union that represents nurses, the Health Employers Association. And we are governed in terms of all of our bargaining for the rules of the game by an entity called the Nurses Bargaining Association. On the other side is the employers, which are all your health authorities. And there is actually over 200 private organizations that also hire and provide healthcare. And their entity that does all of their bargaining is called HEABC, which is the Health Employers Association of BC. So the two players in this game are HEABC and BCNU, BC Nurses Union, the Employer Health Employers Association of BC. Another thing to consider is that even though you as a worker may have the education and qualifications to practice in your field, so that wouldn't just be like healthcare professionals, but it's actually engineers and accountants. We all have licensing bodies which regulate the conditions and policies that we have to practice under in this province. So we are all required to get a license in BC in order to practice. So even though you're educated, that doesn't allow you to work in your field. You have to pay the government the ability to become licensed. And this runs from several hundred dollars into the several thousands. Now, up until now, each sector has been able to have their own licensing body. So when it comes to, say, healthcare, dentists have theirs, physicians have theirs, accountants have theirs. And so what historically has happened is that each sector is able to vote in a board of directors that will represent them. And then they have at least the knowledge and the experience to create policies that actually are beneficial to the worker. However, this has all changed in the last year. In last March, the NDP government introduced and passed Bill 4, which is actually the new Skilled Trades BC Act, where all of the board of directors governing trades are going to be appointed by the government and will be an agent of the government. Last November, Bill 36 was introduced where the NDP government implemented this huge change in the Healthcare Professions and Occupations Act, of which I'm going to address a little bit later. So there has been some public discussion on the fact that why would healthcare workers put the public at risk by not getting vaccinated? And there are some historical and current events that I think I should bring to the table so that you understand why we have taken the position that we have. And much of this information nurses themselves aren't even aware of. So I'm going to highlight this for everybody. In 2015, the Ontario Nurses Union took the province of Ontario to court because they had a policy that nurses, healthcare workers had to abide by, which was called the VOM policy, which is the vax or mask policy. So this required that if you did not take the annual influenza vaccination, you would be required to wear a mask for the duration of the flu season, which could be anywhere from four to 5 months. The Ontario Nurses Union decided that this was discriminatory and so took to arbitration the facts. So they had expert witnesses, they had scientific evidence, and in both cases, both arbitration decisions, it was determined that nurses with no symptoms are highly unlikely to be any real source of transmission in hospitals, and it is illogical to force healthy nurses to mask. Also, they determined that this ended up being just a coercive tool to force healthcare workers to receive immunization. And there was scant evidence to prove that masks reduce that transmission and that the policies implemented were more symbolic than scientifically based. So then in the same years, 2015, 2016, the BC Nurses Union put out every year bulletins saying that they were adamantly opposed to this policy because it was actually in place in BC as well. So in 2017, the BC Nurses Union filed what's called an IWAD, which is an industrial-wide application dispute. And so this matter then went to the employer, Bonnie Henry, the province, and the union, and they also produced and submitted all of their scientific evidence. And as a result, in 2019, this policy was amended. And December 4th, 2019, BCNU Bulletin states, the amendment to the influenza prevention policy ensures that nurses will no longer face discipline for not getting vaccinated or wearing a mask. Now, I know some of you are going to say COVID and influenza are not the same category. Well, this is what I can tell you. COVID and influenza are both respiratory viruses. They end up being treated the same. They have the same infection precautions instituted. And over the last few years, worldwide, the monitoring of COVID was watched by and surveyed through the influenza surveillance systems. So they are actually under the same umbrella. They are a different source of virus, which there is always mutations and changes. However, they are under the same umbrella in terms of how they are categorized and treated. I also will provide for you an internal email from Interior Health stating that they have normalized the COVID virus and are clumping it into the category of all the other viruses in terms of how they're going to be managed in the ERs. Now let's get to the current events. So in the summer of 2021, Bonnie Henry starts sending out communications that healthcare workers are not going to be allowed to work if they're not vaccinated. So then we end up having these public health orders come out where it's mandated that the healthcare workers have to be vaccinated. Except this public health order did not state that any of the workers had to be terminated. This decision was actually implemented by HEABC. Do you remember HEABC? They are the Health Employers Association of BC. They're the entity that governs all the labor relations for all the employers. Now, they are, a lot of the executive are appointed by the Ministry of Health, okay? So they told the health authorities and all the private organizations that they had to terminate the unvaccinated workers, which was in violation of the collective agreements and the policies that we see were just established. Now, remember what I said in terms of what happens when the employer does things they shouldn't do. Well, it's the union's role to enforce that they play by the rules. And so nurses were expecting that this would actually happen. So what really happened was, starting September of 2021, our president resigned. Our vice president went on a medical leave. The CEO that was hired for bargaining went on leave. We had all sorts of communications that regional reps went on leave. And we discovered that the only ones working were stewards who were very ill-equipped to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. The union building was actually empty, except for, it looks like, the accountant was present. In order for us to deal with such a significant issue in our healthcare, the people who were supposed to be present to make sure that things are running well, all were not at work. The main reason why healthcare workers were terminated was because we called bullshit. Now, why did so many nurses, because there's lots of us, decide not to get vaccinated? So I'll give you a few reasons just for your consideration. So most of us have been working frontline for the previous year and a half, effectively using proper PPE. So now all of a sudden, Bonnie Henry is saying, oh, PPE is not going to protect anybody, so we have to remove the unvaccinated from the workplace. At the same time as telling the public, you should be wearing your dirty masks into stores and the public because it will save your life. Then we have an issue where many of us nurses actually encountered patients that were having significant side effects from this vaccination, and we knew that the system was not reporting it. This was becoming very problematic. I also was paying attention to the BC Centre of Disease Control website. And in the 2.5 years that they were documenting COVID deaths, we ended up coming up with numbers that were around the 4,000 mark. The average age of death was 82. The federal government released a report saying the most common comorbidity associated with COVID death was dementia. And they also put on their reports that anyone who had had a positive COVID swab and died within 30 days, no matter the reason, was determined to be a COVID death. In the same time frame, there were 25% more overdose deaths in our province than COVID deaths. And yet there was nothing said by the government in terms of what the real emergency was in our province. And I don't know if you've realized, but at the end of January in BC, it is going to be legal for you to have in your possession the drugs that have caused so many deaths. In the year prior to my termination, I was exposed in the workplace twice to COVID from double vaccinated staff. At that point, public health was doing contact tracing, and so I was notified of this. So I knew prior, and so did Interior Health know prior to the implementation of the mandates, that the vaccination itself was not stopping the infection of COVID. Now, as we move into terminations starting long-term care started earlier, but the acute care termination started in November of 2021. And then we have reports from Adrian Dix in January stating that there was, in 1 week, 18,000 COVID sick call like shifts that were unfilled because staff were sick. I have internal interior health emails stating that they're concerned about the lack of ability to fill shifts because so many staff are sick. And I have freedom of information requests from the health authorities that indicate between November 30th after terminations and June 30th, there were over 20,000 COVID sick calls from double vaccinated staff. So a few things started happening in the new year. Nurses who were affected by the mandates started organizing and getting connected. And then also the BC Nurses Union had to fill the CEO position. And so they chose to put in that position a lawyer who is a partner of the legal firm that is retained by the union for legal counsel and bargaining. I'm just going to put that in there right now. Also, it's important to note that the mandates only affected workers in the public sector. So basically, anyone that gets paid by the government was terminated. All of private healthcare was not impacted. So these are your dentists, chiropractors, optometrists, because they get their revenue from private sources, which is running their own business. They did not have the same leverage to mandate them. So as a result, the government then instead started putting pressure on the licensing bodies. Remember, I was talking about the colleges that provide us the license and the ability to practice. They were putting pressure on the colleges to enforce that every person who had a license had to disclose to the colleges their vaccination status. Well, this resulted in a very significant reaction because this is actually illegal. Your medical information is your private business, and the government does not have the right to access that. They were able to fight back, and as a result, Bonnie Henry was not able to impose mandates on private healthcare. This is kind of significant because up until recently, they have been protected and able to continue practicing in BC. So now I'm going to get into what we discovered with our union's operations. Over the spring, we ended up having to hire some legal counsel to assist us through this process. We're not legally educated or familiar with the process. So we were able to obtain some really good counsel. And the only mechanism that we could use was, like I said, putting in a complaint to the BC Labour Board. Now, we decided to do what's called a Section 12, which is a failure of duty and fair representation. And this was based on the fact that historically, the union, whenever there had been a termination or a suspension of this nature, had always taken it to arbitration, a third party to decide within 90 days. And we were running into a year with no movement. So I started working as a central hub for collecting the evidence that we needed to submit. And so I was getting the documentation from many nurses across the province. And as a result, we were able to really get a clear picture of what had been going on in the union. And that's when we discovered that there had been nobody present during the terminations. And the result after was that we noticed that both the union and the government refused to discuss us at all. We were never talked about. It was like we didn't exist. And our numbers were showing that there was at least 4,000 to 6,000, 7,000 nurses less in the system through terminations and early retirement than the previous year. And just for your idea, that would be the ability to staff another hospital the size of Kelowna. So they have effectively removed that many people from the healthcare system. And that was noticeable in the spring. There was many news articles coming out about the emerges that were closed, the medical units that were closed, patients having to be transferred to other hospitals because of critical staffing shortages, and yet nobody ever would talk about the elephant in the room, which was, you fired so many people. It wasn't just nurses, okay? We're talking lab, paramedics, housekeeping. It was massive, but nobody wants to talk about it. So we start compiling this complaint. And these complaints were filed actually the end of September. And the BC Labour Board has 180 days to process the application and then give us some kind of decision or ruling. And we're about 113 days into the process, and we have not had any communication. So now we discover that, the BC Nurses Union is going to have an annual convention in Vancouver on November 2nd. And we thought, okay, the union itself had stopped communicating with us as of July. None of us were getting any responses to our emails. There was absolutely no discussion about what was happening to the thousands of members that were not able to work in our province. And so we decided we needed to go down and talk to them. So I actually phoned them the day before and said, look, we're coming down. We respectfully request that we can have a meeting with the executive and the membership because we want to be represented. So the response was, when we got to the hotel, the union had actually installed security at every entrance. Now, there were several conventions going on at the same time. Not one of them had security except the union. However, because we're pretty smart and talented, we were able to get by, and we did have a meeting with the executive. There was 9 of them and 13 of us present in the meeting, and here's the proof. Now, in this meeting, we were able to address in person many of the items that we later submitted in documentation. And these are some of the questions that we submitted to the executive. What's happening with our grievances? We were told by legal counsel that she had started the position in February and there were thousands of grievances that were outstanding. She had been, to the best of her ability, trying to get them processed, but it was becoming very difficult. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but there are over 250 employees at this union. And considering that their main job is grievances, it is concerning to me that so many people are getting a really good wage and we don't really know what they're doing. So we now have a process where thousands of grievances are not being processed. The second thing we brought up was the lawyer that had been hired for the CEO position. We actually demanded his resignation. And the reason for this is a conflict of interest. If an executive director can potentially financially benefit personally from work that he sends over to the law firm, then there is an issue of who is he really representing, the union members or his own interests with his legal firm. And so we wanted actually the notes from the meeting that determined why he was hired and if this was even discussed, because there has to be a legal agreement drafted to address this. We also started asking about the financial statements because we had the ability to have someone review it, and there were some significant red flags that were coming up. Inconsistencies in terms of numbers that were recorded at the end of 1 year and then the beginning balance of the next year were not the same. We also noted that there was a defense fund for the purposes of bargaining and labor issues, that the policy was that there was supposed to be $25 million in it, and it had in the previous few years escalated to $60 million. Now, in terms of the utilization of this fund, the last time it had been accessed was job action that was around 2006, 2007. And there had been no draws on it since. Now, the issue is that with $60 million, how does this not fall into the category of profit? And as well, we said you have all these terminated nurses who were not able to get EI. Some are on welfare. Many are actually able to practice outside the province. So we have nurses working in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and it's just here that we can't practice because you're not doing your job. So why don't you actually help us out? And no, that wasn't important. So there were a few things that happened in this meeting, and we were assured that, oh yes, they were going to open some new communication channels to check in with us, and they would do that the following week. And as to all the questions that we submitted, there was 12 pages actually, they would get on it right away. I just want you to know that with 3 formal requests and an actual whistleblower submission complaint as per their policy, we have not received one answer to any of our questions. Bill 36 was passed with an NDP majority vote, even though only 1/3 of this bill was able to be scrutinized and discussed, and now impacts the ability for every healthcare professional to practice in this province. And it is concerning enough that people are afraid, and they are starting to look at getting out of this province to continue to be able to practice in their field. Some of the changes that occurred was, remember how I was talking about licensing bodies and how each sector had their own. So now all of those licensing bodies, there are currently 16 that are going to be amalgamated down to 6. The elected independent board of directors for each sector are going to be removed, and the government is going to appoint their own panel members. Now, Adrian Dix has stated that he's not going to guarantee that there will be anyone from your profession that will be on that panel. And the point of this is to basically standardize discipline for healthcare professionals and to make it easier for the public to be able to access these colleges if there's a problem. Except I am going to just note that, one of the amalgamations they're doing is putting the opticians and the psychologists under the same umbrella, because obviously the practice standards required for psychologists would be similar to an optician. Another issue is that health practitioners can have their licenses suspended or removed if they provide false or misleading information to patients or the public. Now, I believe Shirley Bond asked in the question and answer period, what is the definition of misleading information? This has not been established. Adrian Dix did state in the question and answer period that basically any information that does not align with what the government says can be determined to be misleading. And he actually gave the example that if healthcare professionals provided information, say, about the vaccination that was not what the government was saying, this could actually result in disciplinary measures of 6 months in jail and up to $200,000 fines. Okay, so this is the first time in history that healthcare professionals could be facing jail for providing healthcare interventions that may be different than what the politicians say is in your best benefit. So they are taking away the ability for healthcare professionals to practice their healthcare profession, and they are allowing themselves the ability to dictate what interventions can be provided to the public. Okay, so that's significant. We also have that the NDP government has given themselves the increased power to seize property and assets without a warrant if you are going to be investigated. So if you are a healthcare professional that is deemed to be a threat, the government does now have given themselves the right to be able to enter your premises and seize your property, which includes patients' private medical records, which up until this point, your private medical records have been protected. but now the government has given themselves the authority to seize those records. So your private information is no longer protected. I note that the NDP clearly likes to recognize that there is discrimination in the healthcare system and that they are going to eliminate it, except for some reason they seem to not recognize that they themselves are the worst proponents of this. Now, there's a few things that I would like to highlight because actually there were a few members in legislature that did mount a response to this. And I would like to highlight some of the statements that occurred. Now, there is transcripts of the question and answer period that occurred with the Bill 36. And so I've actually gone into these transcripts to take a look at some of the things that were said. So it was interesting because Shirley Bond brought up that the language in this bill is not plain language. It's difficult for people to understand. Adrian Dix's response, while the language is not always clear, it's English. Bond replies with, well, we seem to be creating law that governs people's practice. This deserves some scrutiny and deserves some ample time for that scrutiny. Dix said, you know what? One does not have a fundamental right to practice. We want to tailor the limits and conditions for that practice. And you may be required to provide urine samples because it would be better to provide a urine sample than not be allowed to practice. I don't know who this guy Bruce Banman is, but he's from the Abbotsford area. And he got up, and I'm going to read out his statement that he made in the discussion of this bill, because the participants were able to recognize dynamics here that were certainly concerning.
This government has decided that after taking a week off, that debate is not worthy in this House. They've invoked closure, and for those at home that are watching, and closure basically means that debate comes to an end. There is a finite deadline, and all of the bills that are currently being debated in the House end up coming to a screeching halt. And I would say, Mr. Speaker, that one of the bills that is before this House right now is one of the largest bills that has come before the House in decades. And all of our emails have been flooded, our inboxes have been flooded about people who have concerns about that bill, which is Bill 36. I know we're here about Bill 43, and I'll get to that. But one of the most important historic bills, one of the lengthiest bills, over 600 and some odd clauses and over 200 and some odd pages. This government decided that, hey, let's all take a week off. We're going to be here anyway. Let's not show up in the House and actually respect the taxpayers that expect us to debate bills. Let's have a holiday for our incoming new Premier instead. I don't know what the reason was to not be here, Mr. Speaker, when we were all here anyway. It's an atrocity. It is an outrage, and I would encourage those that are at home watching to write an email and express your extreme frustration that this government decided not to debate the bills and give them the time that is required. That many of the questions that they sent emails about will never get an answer. Ever.
So let's talk about the accounting end. So we have access to a financial analyst, which, by the way, if you're looking for one, let me know and I will forward you his contact. His role is that he goes through financial statements and he flags anything that looks inconsistent or doesn't make sense, and then he provides reports to investors so that they can determine if it's a safe bet to invest in a company or not. So there were significant things that were flagged in the union's financial statements. Now, part of his role, because he's an analyst, he's not an accountant, we needed to access an actual forensic accountant to be able to determine that the things that he had brought up were legit. So we went to two different national corporations. The first one that we talked to, a massive accounting firm, the individual stated that they were very interested after reviewing his report and actually had experience in taking down a union in Ontario, and was going to just go through the checks in the company to make sure that there was no conflict of interest. She came back and said, unfortunately, I cannot take on this work. My hierarchy has said no. So we went to a second company. Now, interestingly, this company used to be retained by the union back in 2006, 2007, but were fired because during that time, an employee of the union embezzled over $700,000 and it was not caught. So now this company was extremely interested because they had already been caught in the union not disclosing information. And we advanced to the point where we actually had a meeting with their investigators, two of their forensic accountants, and some legal counsel for us. And they were all in. They just had to get one more approval. We were then notified that their hierarchy said they could not get involved. So here we are. We have significant, legitimate questions about how our union is managing their finances. They're playing a lot of the stock market, but somehow their net value has increased 25% in the last year, which is why aren't they managing all of our financial affairs if they are able to make this much money? And we'd like to know how they're coming up with this money, what it's being spent on, and who's controlling it. All of these questions have gone unanswered.
Hiring and training more nurses is part of our own ongoing work to make sure that healthcare is accessible to all British Columbians. And still, we know the demand for the skills and expertise that nurses bring to the job every day has never been more in demand in our healthcare system. There are high-skilled and experienced nurses who want to get to work in our system now, but are facing barriers preventing them from delivering the services that British Columbians need. We need to fix that. Just as we made changes for internationally trained doctors, we need to do the same for nurses. And that's why we're here today. I'm pleased to announce new supports in a faster assessment pathway that will get more nurses working in BC's healthcare system faster. For nurses returning to practice, there will be help with the costs of re-entering the workforce. These are nurses who may have taken a break for practice for any number of reasons and want to come back but are facing financial or other barriers to coming back. We want to support them in coming back to work. This includes application and assessment fee support, along with travel expenses support. Additionally, bursaries of up to $10,000 available for any additional education that those nurses need who are coming back to practice in order to be able to get to work. For internationally trained nurses, we've committed $1.3 million to set up a new pathway.
What? What? Okay. Nurses, are you still fired?
Hi there. Yep, still fired.
Yep, I'm still fired.
Yep, I'm still fired from Interior Health and I'm cleaning people's houses for cash.
I am still fired.
Yep, still fired.
Yes, still fired.
Hey, yeah, I'm still terminated. Starting work in Alberta next week.
Registered nurse, BC born and raised. While BC remains in a healthcare crisis and hospitals and emergency departments have closed, thousands of us ready, willing, and able to work remain fired and looking for employment in other provinces.
My name's Vera. I'm a veteran RN of 27 years with a passion for geriatrics. I was terminated from Interior Health in November of 2021. I'm now in 2023 moving to Alberta where I've had multiple job offers.
January 16th, 2023, going for a walk. lake. It's a beautiful Arrow Lake. Yeah. This is my home province. Born and raised. BC girl. Kids born here. Love it. Mountains, fresh air, lakes, rivers, everything. It's my kind of place. Can't work here. Registered nurse in BC. Haven't been able to work for over a year now. You're forgetting about us, province. Your healthcare is failing you. And you have thousands of nurses walking on a beach wishing they could be working in their province. Instead, we're planning on going to Saskatchewan. I've been to Alberta half a dozen times. Never been to Saskatchewan, but I'm going to go work there. This is my province. I want to be here. I want to help the people here. This is my province.
Now, once Bill 36 was passed, all of a sudden, all the pieces came together and we finally started understanding what was in play here and why our union had delayed processing our grievances and why the only person that was allowed any discussions with the BC government was the CEO. And we determined that all of our representation was delayed so that the government had enough time to implement this bill, making law, which was previously only enforceable under the emergency measures. Now, I don't know if you're aware, there are several court cases going on right now against Bonnie Henry in the Ministry of Health because it looks like there was actually no scientific evidence to support her mandates. And so these court cases are in process. But while that occurred, the government has now made law that healthcare professionals are going to be subject to mandatory vaccination under their licensing requirements. So now what we're expecting, this is just my personal suspicious antennas going up, is that right now our union has to represent us for this employment issue for these terminations. I'm kind of guessing, again, this is just my opinion, that they may, the government might change their position in that, hey, why don't, we'll tell the healthcare workers they can come back, but however, you have to sign off that you're not going to get any compensation. And then they're going to transfer the requirement of vaccination to the licensing body, which means now you cannot get a license to practice unless you follow the mandate or the mandatory vaccinations that they implement, whatever they choose. And now this becomes a licensing issue versus an employment issue, which then takes all the unions off the hook because they don't have to represent you for a licensing issue, only an employment issue. Further, interestingly enough, all of a sudden the BC Union puts out a news bulletin as of December after the bill has been passed that they are now going to file an IWAD on behalf of the terminated nurses. Now, I'd like you to look at all of these things that the union is finally stating is the problem for the terminated. They are fighting that the employer has implemented policies that are unreasonable and in breach of the collective agreement. The employer has breached the collective agreement by failing to take steps to persuade the provincial health officer to revise and/or tailor its vaccine mandate. The employer has breached the collective agreement by denying affected nurses access to various earned benefits under the agreement. They lost their sick time, their vacation time, all of these things were denied. They have breached the collective agreements by termination, and they have breached the BC Human Rights Code. Now, I want you to know that every statement that they put in this bulletin came from our complaints against them that were submitted to the Labor Board, of which they received a copy. What I can tell you is in the November 2nd meeting, they told us that they had filed an IWAD, and we asked for documentation to prove that. At which time they stated, oh, well, actually, we haven't filed the IWAD. It's in process. So this particular release that they have put out, I'd like the actual evidence that they did file an IWAD, because I think they're just doing optics, because this is exactly what we have accused them of failing in. We seem to have a real problem here with our NDP government not letting the public know what the truth is. So I guess it's our job. I'll let you know.
BC government is overhauling the process of hiring internationally trained nurses, as well as offering incentives for nurses who want to re-enter the workforce in an effort to address the critical shortage of healthcare workers. Amin Grewal is the president of the BC Nurses Union and is joining us now with more. Amin, thank you so much for your time today.
Good morning, Sonia.
Good morning. So how do you feel about these steps being taken by the province?
BCNU, the BC Nurses Union, has been advocating for internationally educated nurses to have their credentialing process be transitioning much quicker than the up to 6 years that it's been taking. So this is welcome news to be able to have these nurses coming into the system in a shorter period of time. And to hear that there's 2,000 nurses that are already in the process right now is great news for our nurses who have been working so short-staffed.
I am standing in front of where I used to work. Kootenay Lake Hospital. I was an emergency room nurse. I worked in the COVID units that shut down because there were no patients. I've worked medical units. I do home care in Nelson. I do long-term care in Nelson. Amin, you are making over $200,000 a year, and I am making nothing. You have a job in the union, and your job is to make sure that I have a job. Yet somehow you're getting $200,000 a year plus expenses, and I'm not working. I'm not sure if this is actually a good job for you, because you're not doing it very well. Because the BC Nurses Union did not respond to our concerns about the position of the CEO being filled with a lawyer that is retained by the union, we ended up submitting a complaint to the BC Law Society. Now, I'm going to actually just read this for you so that you know exactly what was stated. They responded repeating what my complaint was, which was, I understand that you are concerned that this lawyer in their capacity as interim CEO may be inclined to financially benefit through this law firm that they are associated with by preferentially retaining for it the union's legal work. You frame your concerns that he would be in a potential conflict of interest. To clarify, the Code of Professional Conduct for British Columbia, for the Law Society, provides that a conflict of interest occurs when there is a risk that the lawyer's representation of the client would be materially and adversely affected by the lawyer's own interests or by the lawyer's duties to another current client. Due to this information provided, there is no evidence that there is a conflict of interest, and that if I have concerns, I have to take it to the union. So I actually looked up the Law Society Professional Code, and I returned a response to them using Section 3.4, Conflicts, Duty to Avoid Conflicts. And in that section, they provide an example of what could be considered a conflict of interest. And so I'm going to also just submit that to you. A lawyer or a lawyer's firm acts for a public or private corporation, and the lawyer serves as a director of the corporation. These two roles may result in a conflict of interest or other problems because they may affect the lawyer's independent judgment and fiduciary obligations in either or both roles, obscure the legal advice from business and practical advice, jeopardize the protection of the lawyer and client privilege, and disqualify the lawyer or the law firm from acting for the organization. I, as a private individual, had to supply their own code for them to review their conduct. And I said to them, Considering you provided this example, my complaint warrants an investigation, especially since it impacts tens of thousands of people. The response back? Sorry. If you have an issue with this, take it to the ombudsperson. So I did. Let's talk about the foreign worker issue. Currently, right now, the BC province is having to rely on agency nurses to staff hospitals. What this means is there are nurses that are employed by the health authorities, and then there are nurses that are employed by private companies, and those private companies contract out their employees to the hospitals. Currently, right now, a travel agency nurse costs the system a minimum of 4 times what the cost is for an employee. Travel agency nurses have to be paid, have their accommodation covered, their transportation, and they usually get a bit more money because they're not getting vacation and pension plan. So right now, the public is paying 4 times for an agency nurse what it is paying for an employee. Then the government now is talking about bringing in foreign worker nurses. The public needs to understand that the education is not the same. Even terminology is not consistent. Names of medications between Canada and the US can be very different. And even in terms of navigation in our system here, which is very complex, if you don't have an understanding of that, then it can mean that a patient doesn't get to an acute center where they need to go. This is going to be problematic as well. Our province has clearly communicated that we have housing issues. So if they're going to bring in thousands of these foreign workers, what is the plan to house them? So are we now going to take away housing from British Columbians so that foreign workers have a place to live while we have qualified people in this province who can actually work? So these are all components that there's also one other consideration in that. Are these foreign workers going to be unionized or not? And then, just so that everyone is aware, when it comes to job action, there are rules around job action. So that's the process of going for a strike. You have to be in bargaining, which means right now, the employer and the employee, the union, are now discussing the rules of the next contract. So we're in that time frame. There has to be an impasse, which means there's no agreement that's reached. Our side can say we want to strike. The other side can say no. And if they happen to say yes, it has to go to a vote before any strike can occur. And if you have infiltrated all of the nursing members with workers who are foreign that are going to vote for whatever the government tells them because their job is dependent on it, this now removes any possibility of union members to respond with a strike vote. Historically, our society had values that created legal protective mechanisms that gave us the ability to have beautiful lives. But our political leaders now have decimated those protective mechanisms, and we discover that the political values needed to maintain our beautiful lives have actually turned into a rotting corpse. We have issues going on all across our country. Justin has given billions of dollars to Ukraine for weapons. He has transferred billions to pharma companies for vaccines that don't work. And so what we have is Canadian assets being transferred to entities of which we don't know what they're doing with that money. Also, at the same time, he's refusing to give more money to healthcare. What we have is a husband who has borrowed a ton of money that he can't pay back, and he spent it all on his mistress while his wife and kids are starving. We have the federal government actively censoring or putting in law to censor all information that's on social platforms. We have in the BC government, they're going to legalize hard drugs by the end of January so that the very thing that is actually killing thousands of people in our province, it's okay to have that. We have increased taxation. We have less and less ability to actually be able to maintain our lives with the incomes that we have. We can't even, even in terms of our practices now, everything is going to be told to us, what we're allowed to do, what we're allowed to say, what toilet paper we have to use. Our politicians have pushed a political disease that basically gave permission to people to be assholes to each other. The discrimination that caused division in our society and within our own family structures was purported to be justified, when all it actually showed was that humanity does not learn from history, and that every generation is going to have to learn these principles themselves. And honestly, over this last year, we failed. This is what oppression looks like. When abuse of authority is normalized, when you as the public are told you're not going to be able to get a doctor, you're going to have to wait and emerge for 12 hours, that medical units are being shut, that units are closed down because of critical staffing shortages, you should expect this. That is oppression. The only reason this is occurring is because of bad decision making, and we need to hold political leaders responsible for this bad decision making. There are way better ways to manage the system. Quit lying to the public. Quit telling them that if you fire thousands of people, it's not going to impact services that the public deserves. Currently, we have 6 health authorities that all have massive layers of management. We don't need 6 health authorities. Everybody's using different computer systems and communication stuff. You know what? We only need one system. We need one computer system across the province, and we need to get rid of 5 layers of management. And then another thing we could do is change the education system for nurses. Currently, if you're an LPN, so you've got training to a certain level and you want to go back to an RN, you have to start your education process all over again. As soon as nursing got changed into post-secondary institutions rather than in hospitals, it became academic focused, which it's not. It's a trade. We are hands-on. So one simple thing is, you take your first year, you're a care aide. You take your second year, you're an LPN. You take your third year, you're an RN. And fourth year, you can go into your specialty. So you can go into emerge training, or if you really want to pursue the academic stuff, then you can take it in the fourth year. But writing a paper with APA format is not the most important thing when it comes to educating a nurse. Now, after I put a bulk of this video together, last night on the news was this broadcast.
Andrea Henders was one of BC's healthcare heroes, a nurse delivering babies at Kelowna General Hospital when COVID-19 hit. Then she lost her job.
It's unfair, it's unjustified. I'm facing right now kind of the end of my nursing career.
Henders is one of nearly 1,000 full-time BC healthcare workers who refused the COVID-19 vaccine, 1% of the workforce. The nurse hoping the province will rescind the vaccine mandate.
We're all kind of equal in the sense that we can all get COVID and transmit COVID, then what's the problem anymore? We're just as healthy, and we worked, almost 2 years of the pandemic. Nobody was vaccinated.
British Columbia is now an outlier in Canada. Only BC and Nova Scotia require the vaccine to work, while Ontario has no broad mandate, but many health workers are mandated by their employer. BC is looking now to move from a provincial health order to a permanent part of a...
So I'm a little bit curious, and I have to say suspicious. After a year and a half, media has not talked about us at all. And like I said earlier in the video, I was wondering if somehow they would end up bringing us back so that they could now make the vaccination issue something that's not employment related but attached to the license. So now I'm suspicious. Is this really because public opinion is changing what's going on, or is this a trap? I've come down to the cemetery so that I can pay my respects to the BC Nurses Union. I really feel sadness because the loss of that entity is going to have ramifications across this province. Why did I make this video? Well, there's a few thoughts I have. Spiritual work is required in order for us to manifest higher ideals in this physical material world. And concepts like justice, integrity, personal responsibility, they all have to be learned individually before it can be experienced collectively. We have to figure out what we believe versus what we're told to believe. Then we have to figure out what are we willing to do to make sure that we can create the beautiful life that we want to have. This is going to be the first step in trying to rebalance power structures. I hope that this video helps you understand why the nurses have continued to oppose political authoritarianism, because it is our fundamental duty to enforce that your rights are protected. Our ethical standards have served us well to this point, and we just cannot be coerced to remove the protective mechanisms that are in place for the public. I just want to put out there that if there are other nurses who have been impacted by these mandates and you want to join our group, because we do have access to legal counsel that will help through any new steps that are imposed by the government, you can find us. Our website is BC Nurses Fight Mandates, and the website is bcnursesfightmandates.ca. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all under the same name. And if you as the public feel that you would like to help us, we could use that help. We are one of the first people that have got to this finish line in terms of holding these entities accountable. And it's been a year and a half. We are nurses that have been unemployed, denied EI, and many have had to leave their families in order to keep working. If you feel like you can financially help us, we'll take everything, because we are using it responsibly and we are doing our best to ensure that the public is protected even at the cost of our own security. So I hope that you feel the depth of protection that we are trying to hold for this place in society, and that it is something that you can see as benefit. Thanks for listening, and that's the latest.